In this video, I'm going to show you a little bit about how to use scripts in ProcessMaker. So scripts are a powerful tool that allow you to do things that you wouldn't normally be able to do just by using the modeler and other parts of ProcessMaker. So sometimes you need to do something a little more complicated. Um, in this case, I'm just going to create a new script and we'll just call it PHP test. And I'm going to pick the language PHP executor. And I'm going to pick a user to run the script as. This is mostly for permissions using the SDK if you're trying to interact with other parts of the application. So don't worry, you have to pick one, but don't worry about that too much. Timeout is how long the script will take before it throws an error and stops it from running and throws an error in your process when you're using this in a process. So I'm going to save that. And you start out with this basic example, and it just doesn't return anything. It returns an empty array right now. So everything that gets returned, you want it to be an associative array in PHP or an object if using JavaScript, for example, something with key value pairs. And that's going to make it easy to use in your processes. In this case, we could actually just have it return foo bar. And when you run this, we'll just get that same output. This is then converted to a JavaScript object, and that's why you get it here. Feel free to nest arrays in there too if you want. So you can use any sort of any PHP functionality in here. This is all sandboxed inside of a Docker container, so it's very safe. It does have access to the outside internet, so be careful if you're using public API endpoints, but you're more than welcome to. So if I do something like, well, I is less than, 10, you could just do I equals 0, and we can set up a result equals empty array, and we can just put result. Then I could return result like that. Let's see what this does. And so you can see we can just create any sort of code you want to return or do anything. The other thing you should know about is that there are two ways of getting data into this. There's configuration and sample input. Configuration is something that's set the same on every process. So when you're running this in a process, there'll be an area where you can configure this. And I can do anything here. I could just say something hi, and this has to be a JSON object, right? Then you have access to a global variable called config. And so if I access that from there, you'll see it gets returned down here. So in sample input, this is actually data that'll come from every individual process request. This will be the variables that are in that process request. We put this request here as an example because you'll always have access to that within the script. So anytime you want to get the request ID, for example, you'll be able to get that by using your input. So that you access this type of input data that comes from the process that's actually running is called data. So if I wanted to access the request ID, for example, I could do that and then ID. You see, this should actually return null when I get the sample output. Yeah. So if I just change this to an example number and I run it, then I'll get that number back here. So the difference between the data and the config is that this changes based on the request, and config doesn't. That's just going to be set in the process. You don't really use config all that much, at least I haven't. It is useful if you want to reuse scripts in the same script in other parts of your process and just change some of the functionality if it's a similar script doing a similar thing. But we'll get into that later in some of the other demos. So this is just a really basic example of how to run scripts using the script executor. It's important to note that these two things, configuration and sample input, are only used here. The input that you put in here is only available in the context of this script, and it's only for testing purposes. So these won't have anything you put in configuration and sample input, including this already populated request example, um, will not affect anything when you're running the process itself. It's just so that you can test it in the script editor itself. You can also get data from the internet and use that in your scripts. So here's an example of getting the current weather for Las Vegas. Um, the script executor has Guzzle built into it, which is the PHP client for fetching any API information off the internet. So in this case, I created a Guzzle client and I set the URL to this National Weather Service API endpoint, and then I JSON decode the response from that, and I get properties off of that. So if I return um, the response, you'll see I get all this information back from the National Weather Service. The current temperature is 42 degrees Celsius. It's pretty warm. So anyway, that's an example of how to get information from the internet into your scripts.